Well, good afternoon to all of you. I think we are running a bit behind time, but I thank Suhun for this opportunity to talk to you, and I decided to choose a rather intriguing title, A Complex Tale of Two and More Cities. Now, I want to first start talking about a city that is steeped in history, Venice. Now, for centuries, the city of Venice was a flourishing center of trade between Europe and Asia, especially in silk, grain, and spices. And by the 13th century, Venice had become the second largest city in Europe after Paris, and its most prosperous. But then, two Black Swan events struck at the very foundation of Venice's wealth. First, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453 disrupted the traditional land trade route from Europe to Asia, forcing Europe to find alternative trade routes to the east. Then, at the turn of the 16th century, Portugal's discovery of a sea route to the East Indies by the explorer Vasco da Gama undermined Venice's monopoly. It produced profound consequences for Europe in the Middle Ages and changed the game forever for Venice. And new ports emerged in Europe's trade with the East. Cities like Amsterdam and London assumed new dominance. Venice had no response, but continued to trade in reduced circumstances. And the economic center of Europe shifted towards the Atlantic, making the Mediterranean a backwater and Venice a peripheral power. And with its centrality as a commercial hub broken, Venice declined and eventually fell to the Austrians in 1797. Now let me turn to Boston, a city that reinvented itself at least 3 times in its 400-year history. Now the Harvard economist Edward Glaser tells of how Boston in the 17th and 18th century was the leading port in America. Boston thrived as a conduit of goods between the old world and the new. But by the mid-18th century, Boston as a port had been eclipsed, first by Philadelphia and then New York. Now, what saved Boston from the fate of other New England ports was a large population of Irish immigrants. And by the late 19th century, Boston had transformed itself into a center of manufacturing built on immigrant labor, and it prospered on the back of America's industrialization. But Boston's heady period of growth was over by the 1920s. Population growth slowed and even began to shrink after 1950. However, in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, Boston again reinvented itself, this time round from an industrial city in decline into a high-tech, service-based economy. And its population grew rapidly again between 1980 and the year 2000, reversing 50 years of stagnation and shrinkage. Boston is now a center of the information economy, and today education is the dominant factor in its economy. Boston ranks highly in its share of employees in managerial and professional jobs. Its top 4 export industries today are all skills-based: technology, finance, education, and healthcare. Now, Ed Glaser draws a couple of key lessons from the story of Boston. First, long-term urban success does not depend on perpetual, uninterrupted growth, but on successfully responding to challenges. Second, the ability to reorientate and create new value hinges on economic diversity, or economic complexity, as new research suggests. From its earliest days, Boston was never just a port. Artisans manufactured some of the goods traded on Bostonian ships. Boston had banks, brokers, and insurers from its seafaring days because shipping needed financial services. Education was always valued in the colony, and Harvard was founded in 1636 with government money. Throughout its transformations, Boston relied on its base of human capital, shipping and sailing skills, Irish migrant labor, and now skills in the technology, professional services, and educational industries. Its rich complex strengths and competencies built up by luck and good governance enabled Boston to reach within itself to find new connections and value propositions. And these enabled Boston to reinvent itself time and again, when other more brittle cities, like Detroit, heavily dependent on manufacturing, went into decline. Now, changes in demographics, technology, trade routes, and geopolitics can gradually or even suddenly diminish a city's or a country's standing. It is dangerous to assume that a high level of predictability and order exists in the world. Among other things, the tales of these two cities, of Venice and Boston, teach us that there are hidden dangers that we cannot see. These dangers often arise because of complexity. The world is complex, cities are complex, and the operating environment is complex. And how cities respond to these challenges of complexity will determine their success or failure. Now, complexity is defined by the relationships between the agents and systems that act within it and outside it. These relationships and the actions of agents within and outside can give rise to collective behaviors that are often unanticipated and not well understood. And such collective behaviors can deliver discontinuous and nonlinear shocks to the system, like the Black Swans of Nicholas Nassim Taleb, who described them as rare, hard to predict events with large impact. Complexity science tells us that within a city, there are countless agents, people, institutions, markets, networks, interacting with each other in unpredictable ways that are often hidden from view. Then again, the city interacts with other cities, nationally, regionally, and globally, again with all the characteristics of an even larger complex system. Now, such complex systems are characterized by emergent outcomes that are not always predictable ex ante, and such emergent outcomes can be black swans. In complex systems like cities, the Newtonian characteristic of clear cause and predictable effect is often absent. It is not always possible to use deterministic, linear analysis to work out the effects of a policy input. And this means that policies can lead to unexpected outcomes and unpredictable effects. The capacity to deal with complexity of cities and its manifestations like black swans is part of good governance. The pace of urbanization is picking up, increasing the challenges to good city governance. By 2030, 60% of the world's 8 billion population will live in cities, and I think there's another slide saying by 2050 it will be 70%. The middle class is expanding as well. They are forced to contend with, especially in the cities. Governments ignore this group at their peril. And it's not just their buying power. Globally, the middle class is losing faith with its narrative. They are beginning to become what sociologist Catherine Fieschi calls the reluctant radicals, who are behind urban phenomenon like the Occupy Wall Street movement, the fair elections protests in Moscow, free fair movement in Brazil, and the anti-government protests in Turkey. With the increasing diversity of inhabitants in cities, in particular the growth of the middle class, the variation in needs and demands will grow. Beyond meeting the basic survival needs of Maslow's hierarchy, cities also need to provide for higher order issues to meet the rising expectations of the citizenry, such as nature preservation, conservation of heritage, providing lifestyle services, and promoting cultural activities. As complex systems, cities produce wicked problems. Political scientist Horst Rittel described wicked problems as highly complex issues with multiple stakeholders who more often than not have different perspectives. Wicked problems, unfortunately, have no immediate or obvious solutions. They hardly ever sit conveniently within the responsibility of any single agency or authority. A striking demographic projection is that while today, 1 in every 5 people in the world above the age of 65 lives in China, by 2030 it will be 1 in 4. Japan is already riding the silver tsunami. More cities, especially those in China, are going to have to confront the twin challenges of an aging population and the loss of economic vigor. If they are to sustain themselves over the long term, and if they cannot improve their TFR, total fertility rate, then they will have to get rich before they get old. An aging population is a particularly wicked problem for cities. It has many second and third order consequences for other sectors. While an aging population obviously has impacts in areas like pensions, healthcare provision, and accessibility of the built environment, it also throws up the challenge of an older and potentially shrinking workforce. Solutions like increasing the retirement age or filling gaps in the workforce with more migrant workers will have consequences. Increasing the retirement age would require creating jobs suitable for older workers, and this could affect overall labor productivity. With more elderly workers in the system, career progression and opportunities for younger people could be affected. Employing more migrant workers might quickly plug gaps in the workforce, but can also have adverse impact on social cohesion and wage levels. There's clearly no silver bullet that can quickly or comprehensively settle the wicked problem of an aging population. As I've mentioned earlier, in complex systems like cities, policies can have outcomes and effects that are not easily predicted. In Singapore, the authorities over the last 5 years have tried to stabilize the housing market to ensure the price move in line with economic fundamentals. And in the beginning, a cocktail of stamp duties, loan limits, and increases in down payments was introduced to cool the hot housing market and to control the growth in housing prices by dampening speculative buying and encouraging prudence among home buyers. But each wave of measures resulted in smaller than expected impact on the housing market, and it became clear that the housing market was more complex than originally thought, with different factors such as rapid economic growth, immigration policies, open capital markets, and low interest rates after the subprime financial crisis, each having a role and interacting with each other in very complex ways, not amenable to modeling or linear analysis. The dynamic that drove the continued buoyancy of the housing market became only clearer in hindsight. Hindsight showed that the housing market was far more complex than we had assumed or even understood. A major lesson learned is that in operating in complex systems, policies may not always lead to the desired outcomes, and that governments must be willing and able to constantly fine-tune and adjust policies as new evidence of success or failure emerges. And this is not necessarily evidence of poor governance, but a reflection of what it takes to manage in complexity. Cognitive biases make it difficult for people to recognize early warning signals of an impending crisis or slow burn emerging issue, let alone to act on them. As a result, governments, peoples, and nations often hesitate and wait for crises or disasters to unfold before they take decisive action. And just look what's happening with the budget shutdown and debt ceiling in the US. And the consequences of hesitation can sometimes be catastrophic. Over the last 30 years, Singapore developed a well-designed and sophisticated drainage system, which we thought had made widespread and prolonged floods a thing of the past. But continued urbanization and climate change has brought about an increase in the intensity, frequency, and duration of rainfall and rendered the drainage system, which had worked well for decades, inadequate. And this shows that assumptions used in developing solutions must be revisited now and then to keep pace with changes in the operating environment. We cannot assume that what we have in place will remain relevant or adequate to meet our needs forever. Governments must expect that surprises like Black Swans will happen. Revisiting of policy assumptions and the awareness of cognitive biases are needed for cities and their governments to reduce the frequency of surprises and the amplitude of shocks. The dominant characteristic of complex systems is the countless agents interacting within it. And this makes it very difficult for single agencies to deal with problems arising from complexity. Instead, developing policies and plans to deal with black swans and wicked problems generated by complexity requires a whole-of-government approach. Now, it recognizes that in complex environments, insights and good ideas are not the monopoly of single agencies or of government acting alone. Instead, people from different organizations, both from within and outside government, come together and pool their knowledge in order to discover potential solutions. Now, in Singapore, we adopt such a whole-of-government approach to urban planning. This approach is an acknowledgement of the complexity of the urban environment. It enables us to consider long-term scenarios, devise implementation strategies and plans, and control and coordinate developments on the ground, all in a coordinated and integrated way. The entire process, from the review of our strategic concept plans to the implementation of detailed land use master plans, is a whole-of-government process that involves close collaboration among economic, social, and development ministries and agencies, as well as consultations with various stakeholders, the private sector, and the general public. But I should add here that whole-of-government does not come easily, and it goes really against the order of human nature and how bureaucracies work. So it requires very strong leadership and constant attention from the top. The challenges that complexity throws up cannot be solved simply by replicating what had worked well in the past. Governments should be willing to put aside tried and tested perspectives and instead to experiment with new approaches and solutions, like Mayor Eric Lee's efforts to build childcare centers in Taipei or HDB's initiatives in new towns like Punggol. In Singapore, we take this approach in addressing the problem of congestion on public transport systems. Traditional approaches of alleviating congestion in public transportation systems often involve such supply-side measures as increasing the frequency of train and bus services, growing fleet sizes, using vehicles with larger capacities, or building new routes. However, new strategies are also needed given the rise in complexity and diverse expectations. In Singapore, we are currently experimenting with a palette of behavioral levers to encourage commuters to make changes to their travel patterns to help reduce transportation demand during peak hours. And these include providing free travel on rail trips into the city in the early parts of the weekday mornings, working with various organizations to pilot flexible work arrangements that stagger reporting hours or enable working off-site, or cash rewards for making morning off-peak trips on the rail system. And these experiments carry relatively little risk, but enable us to try out new ways to address the congestion problem. Today's public services are predominantly delivered in one direction, from government to the customer. And although these are processes for public feedback, public services are largely conceptualized and developed within the public sector. However, this mindset of government knows best is increasingly challenged in today's world, where citizens and businesses can easily access much of the information that governments used to monopolize and control in the past. At the same time, the burgeoning of social media has given citizens new modes of organizing themselves around new rallying points. Public discourse is far more difficult to shape. The previous model was Government 1.0. It was characterized by strong government regulation, seeking compliance with policy rules, and maintaining an efficient a system as possible. But in today's landscape, something new, Government 2.0, if you will, is required. Governments and municipal authorities will have to build strong partnerships with non-government stakeholders in order to tackle complex problems. Government 2.0 is more adaptive and a more emergent approach, and is a shift from government for you to government with you. In this approach, governments will increasingly co-create policies and plans with the people and the private sectors. And I think Tan Chin Nam and Cheong Koon Hian mentioned this. By engaging citizens and businesses, not only will they gain fresh insights and ideas to deal with wicked problems and other challenges arising from complexity where no one has a monopoly of wisdom, they will also address the rising expectations of Maslow's hierarchy. Now, the complexity of cities that produces black swans and wicked problems places huge demands of governments and municipal authorities. Those that are able to organize themselves to embrace the concept of Government 2.0, those that can manage complexity, overcome their cognitive biases, develop the resilience to black swans, are the ones that are going to gain a competitive advantage over those that cannot. The examples of Boston and Venice teach us that nothing is forever and that the most adaptable and flexible cities are the ones that will survive and succeed in the long term. Thank you.